Okay, we've seen Telnet in action using Python. Now it's time to see how to connect to a router via SSH and do the same things as before. Remember that SSH should be preferred over Telnet whenever you have the chance to do so. It's a matter of securing the communication. The first thing we should do is to go to the router and clear the TechX configuration we did in the previous lecture. So conft no TechX server host 1.2.3.4. Okay, let's see. Do show TechX. Okay, good. Now we should prepare the router for accepting SSH connections. You should first check your router configuration for R1. If you loaded the configuration downloaded from my drive, you should already have most of the SSH settings in place. If for some reason you don't, then check the text file attached to this lecture and paste the configuration commands from there. Even with the settings pasted from the files on my drive, you should also generate a new SSH RSA key on your router using the following command, and use at least 1024 bits for encryption. So, crypto key generate RSA, enter. Now you should type in 1024. Okay, and SSH2 has been enabled. Good. Now your router should be ready for accepting SSH connections. Let's get into the Python file. Now, although the task is the same, to send a bunch of commands to the router and see the results, I will add two upgrades in this application. First, I'm not going to explicitly assign values to the username and password variables. Instead, they will be read from a file, as we'll do with the commands. So this time we'll have two files, one for the login credentials and another for the commands to be sent. The second upgrade is a check for the Cisco syntax that we use. Maybe when typing a command in the command file, you misspell a word. If that command gets sent to the router, then it will not be executed, and the Cisco iOS will return an invalid input error. That's why we want to notify the user when this happens. Okay, having that said, let's study the code. Remember, you don't have to memorize the code, just understand it and use it or customize it according to your needs. You have this template available for download in a dedicated lecture. The first thing I did is import Paramico, which is the SSH module used in Python, the time module to have the sleep function available like we did in the lecture about Telnet, and also the RE module because we are going to use one of its functions. Next, I defined the function called OpenSSHCon, which takes an IP address as parameter. The code inside the function is again wrapped in a try-except block, the difference being that this time the exception we cover belongs to the Paramico module, and it is called authentication exception. This is raised when the wrong credentials are used for the connection. As I said, this time we are going to read the username and password from a file. So let's go ahead and create that file. Touch SSH credentials.txt. Inside the file, I'm going to write the username and password on the same line, separated by a comma, no spaces involved. So the password is Python. Let's save the file. In the Telnet lecture, we specified the file name using row input. We can do the same for our files in this lecture, but where would be the fun? Instead, let's pass both files as arguments when running the command from the Linux shell using sys.argv. Remember sys.argv? As a recap, when running the command, the first argument, sys.argv of 0, is the Python file name. Then we are going to enter the username password file. This will be sys.argv of 1. And finally, the commands file, which will be sys.argv of 2. That's why we are going to need to import the sys module also. So import sys. Okay, let's save our file. Now the next two lines of code are for opening the file, for reading, and ensuring that the cursor is positioned at the beginning of the file each time we run the application. Next, I use the readlines method to get a list where each element is a line in the file, and then some string methods to extract the username from that file. To understand what I did below, let's go in the Python interpreter and create a list identical to the one we are going to obtain from the readlines method. In our case, Python will return a list with a single string element, because we have only one line in our file. So let's go into the Python interpreter shell and create a list similar to the one we will get from the readlines method and store it in a variable. So let's say a equals, okay, let's see a. Now to extract the username, we should refer to the first and only element in the list. That will have the index 0, right? So let's see a of 0. So a of 0 will extract the string from the list. Good. Now let's extract the username part of this string. But how? Well, the first step is to split the string using a separator. And that separator is the comma, of course. So we should apply the split method on a of 0. So a of 0 dot split, and let's mention the comma as a separator. This operation returns another list with each element being the string that was previously separated by comma. Now the final step is to extract the desired string from the list, and since we want the username, that would be the first element in the list. So we should add the 0 index to this expression, and we got our username. The same procedure applies for extracting the password, only this time we should use index 1 to get the second element of the list. So if we use 1 instead of 0, we get Python. Cool. Now I applied the same principle in our SSH application. So you can see this is the username and this is the password. Notice that I added the write strip function for the password to avoid catching any new line characters in the string we extract. That could give you some headaches when you try to connect to the device. Okay, now it's time to open an SSH session to the router. This is done by invoking the SSH client class from the Paramika module. So this is what this line does right here. The next line of code should be used cautiously. It can allow or deny unknown host keys. In a test environment like ours, you should use auto add policy right here to not overcomplicate things. But in a production network, it might be better to use reject policy, this one over here, which is commented, for automatically rejecting unknown host names and keys. Either way, don't forget to add this line to your code before the lines defining the actual connection to the router. Now the next line simply starts the connection to the IP address given as argument when calling the function. As soon as the connection is established, we should create an object that invokes an interactive shell session on the device using the invoke shell method. Now, unlike telnet lib that uses the write method to send commands, Paramiko uses simply send. The next lines of code are very similar to the ones we've seen with telnet. So, setting the terminal length to 0 to disable pagination, entering the global configuration mode, opening the file containing the commands to be sent for reading, reading from the beginning of the file using the seek method, and finally sending each line in the file, each command, to the router using a for loop. Finally, you should always remember to close your files once you finish working with them. Of course, if you want to see the output returned by the device, Paramiko allows you to do that using the recv method for the current connection. This is similar to the readVeryEager method from telnet. You can also specify how many bytes of data you want to receive from the router, in our case 65,535, which I think is the maximum value for this argument, and store this output into a variable for further use, like printing, for example, which we're going to do below. Now here's the check I told you about. It checks for iOS syntax errors. So, using an if block and the search function for pattern matching, if that error message, invalid input detected, is found anywhere in the output we receive from the router, then the user is notified that something went wrong. So this message right here gets printed. Also notice that using a format operator, the %s, I introduced the IP address of the router in the printed string by passing the IP variable after the print statement. I think we should also see the output returned by the device. That's why I added the print statement right here. And finally, don't forget to close the SSH session, and you're done. The last thing we should do is define the except block. It states that if an authentication exception is raised by paramico in the try block, then the user should be notified that something went wrong at login. The final thing to do is, of course, calling the function. Now let's run our application. The TechX setting from the previous section was deleted in the beginning of the lecture, so let's use the same file as before for the commands, telnet commands.txt, python ssh template.py. Now the first argument to pass to this command is the credentials file, so ssh credentials.txt, and then the second parameter will be the file containing the command, so telnet commands.txt. Remember, we defined those at the beginning of the file right here using sys.argv. So let's run the file. Great, it works. We can see the output returned by the device printed out on the screen. Let's also manually verify that TechX configuration has been applied on the router. So let's do a do show TechX. Great, looks good. Also notice that another log message has been generated for our SSH connection. So this applies for both telnet and SSH. Now for some final tests, let's test the if statement by misspelling a command in the commands file. So let's modify the file and then run the application one more time. So let's delete a letter from TechX. Okay, let's save it and now run our application one more time. Okay, notice the message right here. There was at least one iOS syntax error on the device, and it gives us the device IP address. So great, this works too. Now let's correct our deliberate misspelling and try using an invalid username, for example, and see if the defined exception is raised. So let's correct this first. An A here. Okay. Now let's edit the SSH credentials file. Let's forget a letter here. Okay, let's save it. Now let's run our application one more time. Success again. The exception was raised and the error messages have been printed on the screen. Okay, great. I know this was a long video, but I hope you learned about Python and SSH and you had some fun too. Next we are going to talk about Python and SNMP.